It's Halloween 1938. You know the story. Orson Welles and his goons are reading a script for that night's episode of the Mercury Theater on the air. Tonight's Halloween special is presented in a way that's more like a news broadcast than an actual radio show, and what follows is an intense reading of H.G. Wells' sci-fi thriller War of the Worlds, adapted into a live stage play. The rest is, well, history.
The date of the broadcast was clearly stated as being 1939. Came, of course, as a great shock to us that the invasion by mythical monsters from the planet Mars should have so profound an effect upon radio listeners.
People go ballistic, hysterical even, thousands of people believing the radio broadcast to be a real event unfolding before their eyes, ears, I guess. People start going crazy, robbing stores, calling the cops, getting naked, and just straight up causing a ruckus. The papers ran wild with the story. Wells even got stopped by what he described as reporters looking for blood. The radio station which he hosted the broadcast soon forced Orson Welles to apologize, which he complied. By this point, the world already knew all about this broadcast and how a bunch of stupid Americans believed it. Even a certain angry mustache dictator got his 2 Reichs in. We don't talk about the third one. A whole nation fooled by a simple broadcast. It must have been one convincing broadcast. Except, nobody was really fooled, actually. The reality was that this story was greatly exaggerated. If anything, it might have been a complete lie. Even H.G. Wells, the author of War of the Worlds, was skeptical of the claims of America's hysteria over a silly radio show.
Are you sure there was such a panic in America, or wasn't it your Halloween fun?
It has come to question just how widespread this panic really was, with many acknowledging that the broadcast mentioned several times that the show was just that, a show. A poll at the time even proved that many people weren't actually fooled. In reality, it's likely that the papers at the time were very threatened by radio's sudden and rapid growth, so when they broke the story that Americans were having a tizzy over this very clearly fake story that was being read to thousands of people, well, who do you figure were the first to demand more restrictions and censorship for radio? But regardless of whether or not America was scared that Martian men were after us, or if it was a greatly exaggerated tale by a jealous medium, the fact remains that this whole quote-unquote incident story is, in fact, a paradox. Now think about it. If people truly did believe that Orson Welles' broadcast was true, then that means that the nation was fooled by a fictional story. But if all of that was faked and a hoax, and we just sort of believed in this old urban legend, then that means the nation was fooled by a fictional story, just a different one. Storytelling is a powerful medium that can inspire and sometimes deceive. And though some of you might have thought that I was going to talk about the War of the Worlds broadcast for the entirety of this video, the truth is, there's a movie that repeats almost everything that the original broadcast did, and it's called Without Warning is a mockumentary film disguised as a real news broadcast of UFOs suddenly visiting Earth. It's got the makings of what could have been a retelling of Orson Welles' supposed incident, yet the movie was presented with an original story, a story that has aliens, sure, but not the same kind of aliens from said broadcast. It's a slow burn suspense film that builds itself up, going from a special news bulletin interrupting a movie called Without Warning to the possibility of an alien crash site landing on Earth, until the film gradually heads towards the inevitable point where humans have made contact with another intelligent life. Yet our response is one that could have spelled our doom. It's a remarkable, convincing film, and so much about it is done so well, from the acting to the way it was shot to hell, even the science shown. And yet this movie made sure that it would never fool anyone. Believe it or not, that was actually the intent of the filmmakers at the time, because honestly, if they really wanted to, Without Warning could have absolutely fooled the nation. had it not been for very subtly placed clues, and some not so subtle, that helped to assure the American people that it was just a movie. And yet, people were still fooled by it. Aired on the 56th anniversary of the original broadcast of War of the Worlds, Without Warning is a sci-fi mockumentary told in the perspective of a news broadcast that suddenly interrupts a film called, well, Without Warning. Now, as much as I say that this film has very subtle clues indicating that it was a work of fiction, it should also be noted that these subtleties don't suffice for the higher-ups, and that's pretty evident because the first thing you see, well, if you would have watched this live back in the 90s, is, well, this.
56 years ago tonight, America was shaken to its core by War of the Worlds, Orson Welles' classic radio broadcast about an alien invasion of Earth from Mars. Many Americans believed visitors from outer space had actually landed, and there was nationwide panic. It was the most startling radio broadcast of all time. On tonight's anniversary of War of the Worlds, CBS presents another story, perhaps as disturbing and equally alarming. What you are about to see is pure fiction. It is not actually happening. But could events depicted in this special program someday take place? Judge for yourself. Without Warning.
I love that. I love that tagline so much. Feel free to panic. It's kind of cool. The immersion is broken pretty much immediately with this sign, and as the broadcast goes on, the program constantly reminds you after every commercial break that the following is a work of fiction. They really didn't want a repeat of the previous War of the Worlds incident, which again is debatable if it ever happened, and what happened after this film, well, we'll talk about it. Honestly though, if I could be a bit mischievous, I kind of wish they just let loose and didn't inform the people that this was made up. I really would have loved to have seen if this was just played out straight and see if anybody would have actually been fooled. Like, how far would people really go if they believed that the aliens were actually coming to destroy us? But I don't know. That's just me. I'm kind of a sick and twisted individual who's still currently under investigation by the FBI, so I guess, you know, I'm kind of different. Anyway, so the movie starts out fine, a sort of, I guess, suspense mystery film about something that doesn't really matter, when suddenly, whoa, without warning, we're told of an asteroid that crash landed on Earth. It's hit 3 different locations. Now, if it weren't obvious from not only the beginning of the film, but as well as this little graphic right here, Sander Van Oker was a news reporter and someone who had retired just 2 years prior to this movie. And that's something I really love about this film, because it would seem to me that some higher-ups of this movie just were too scared of scaring people or fooling people, or let's be honest, the fear of being sued by people or lying. In fact, Wolper, the writer of this movie, even said so that was the case, stating, "In the initial stages, CBS was very supportive of us faking it as best as we could. They were completely on board. It was just as we were starting to go through the process, I think we were so successful, they were actually getting scared. They were backtracking because Rob, the director, and Peter, the producer, and everybody, the team had just done such a good job of it." So they sprinkled pretty obvious hints that this is a fake. However, the really subtle stuff, like having Sander Van Oker, a retired news reporter, reporting this news, is really cool. The film is pretty much littered with clever, subtle stuff like this. Like, there's also the inclusion of all these famous actors, such as Jane Kaczmarek, who had worked on several projects at this point. You might even know her for her later role as the mom from Malcolm in the Middle. Hey, cool. Then we have John Delancey, who is famous even at this point as his role as Q, a sort of nod that this is in fact a science fiction film. And these are just a few subtle nods at the audience, always winking at us and saying, yeah, we know it's fake. Yet it never really feels like an insult at all. It never feels like a lie or pandering. I mean, in reality, it kind of isn't a lie, because, believe it or not, some of the people that are in this film are real broadcasters, real reporters. In fact, a lot of them are. Anytime you see someone credited as themselves, it's likely that they're a real reporter who are just joining in on this fun. Now, to be honest, I don't really want to do a play-by-play of the film. Describing the events of the film would be reductive of its narrative. As of right now, there are two different versions of this movie that exist on YouTube, one that plays the film more straight like a movie, and one that includes the edits, the in-between messages they added during its live broadcast, and its commercials, and to really replicate this movie's vibes when it first released back in the 90s, and you can watch either version. I do highly recommend this movie either way though, as it's very much played differently than most contemporary mockumentaries nowadays, in that not only is it just a slow build up to the end of the film, which I won't spoil just because I think it's worth finding out yourself, but it's also just a very grounded, realistic approach to this entire subject matter that it's almost eerie. And like I said, lots of this is very scientifically accurate, so much of this comes off almost too real to the point that it might be kind of boring to some. I know, it's a really weird compliment to give this film, but I don't want to play off this movie like it's a horror film with scary alien sightings, horrifying visuals, and jump scares. This is, in its very core, one of the most grounded, realistic, and believable mockumentaries I've ever seen, and I've seen a ton. Now, that's not to say that there aren't any creepy moments. Far from it. There are several moments that really make your skin crawl. Lots of elements of this film kind of hit you with a sense of existential dread and make you feel how small you really are and how our understanding of the universe is infinitely smaller than any of us could ever understand, and that alone is scary. In terms of visually, yeah, there's no real one moment that's visually scary, though they do have some really cool VHS effects. Though again, the ending might freak you out a ton. It does have something that's visually scary, though I again won't spoil it. The sound design of this movie, however, can really disturb you. Like this one little girl they find who can't talk English and instead speaks this strange language that cannot be deciphered for most of the movie, yet it's strange and unsettling and bizarre to hear all the same.
I cannot tell you what she is saying. As you can see, she appears badly burned. How she survived, I will never know.
These moments come out of nowhere, and combined with the realistic approach to what might happen when life outside our planet is made contact with, it ultimately creates a movie experience unlike others. The movie was so cool, and honestly, watching this live on my Twitch channel, twitch.tv/Goose_Boose, by the way, was a genuine treat. So now with the movie fully explained, let's take a peek at the behind the scenes stuff. There are three notable figures that end up making Without Warning what it is, those three being executive producer David L. Wolper, writer Peter Lance, and director Robert Iskov. These may not be names you recognize immediately, but they're three people with a distinguished background, starting with Wolper. David L. Wolper is a man with a serious seasoned career in producing television programs and film, most famously Willy Wonka and LA Confidential, the latter coming out just a few years after Without Warning. Needless to say, a man with his career spanning 60 years starting since the late 40s, early 50s would know a thing or two in how TV programs operate, adding to the vibe of the film, making it far more authentic in feel and atmosphere than anyone could anticipate. Writer Peter Lance is a serious, no-nonsense journalist who has investigated and covered serious historical events, now writing true crime novels. His writing style and experience in journalism gave the film a breath of life, creating dialogue that mirrors the tone of reality when humans are at odds with grave and unknown enemies. And Robert Iskov, someone who was familiar with drama from his past in theater and TV film production, mostly dramatic TV films, which really helped with the tension this film brings with its subject matter, as well as having past experience with variety shows, allowing him to know how to pace a movie where the camera is constantly changing from studio to outside to a helicopter and a multitude of different venues. With these three at the helm, they set off to make what they considered at the time a throwback to War of the World, but I'd be lying if I'd say it was a completely unique concept, barring the fact that it's just a retelling of War of the Worlds, just in a modern setting. This movie isn't the first attempt at a news broadcast mockumentary film. I figure movies like Special Bulletin, Countdown to Looking Glass, and more popularly nowadays, Ghost Watch would be films brought up by fans of these kinds of movies, mockumentaries, but specifically mockumentaries about straight-faced newscasters documenting what seems to be real news at the time or a live event of sorts. This format was even copied as recently as 2013 with the film WNUF Halloween Special. Anyone know about that one? It's kind of obscure, but pretty cool. Maybe I'll talk about it someday. Anyways, so you might be thinking that Without Warning just copied those movies, right? After all, they came years prior, so it's just a copycat, right? Well, surprisingly, this movie was technically made years prior either of these films, any of these films that were mentioned actually, like nearly 30 years prior. No kidding. Mark Wolper, David Wolper's son, who was still pretty green while co-producing with his father on this project, was brainstorming with Peter Lance about a film to pitch to CBS, and then Lance, while looking at a bookshelf full of unsold scripts and ideas in Wolper's office, just found this script tucked in between other rejected or otherwise unused screenplays, and it dated back to 1968. 25 years prior to the production of Without Warning, although at the time it wasn't called that, and the writer, none other than famed Omen writer David Seltzer. Pretty crazy. What's more is that Mark Wolper only changed the dates of when the events in the script stories take place, and when he sent it off to CBS, well, they loved it. They bought the rights to the film and allowed Lance and Wolper to produce the movie, and boy did they produce the movie, having one of the quickest turnarounds in film I've ever heard, starting from the 27th of August and broadcasting the film on the 30th of October that year. Barely 2 months of filming, editing, and writing the entire plot. Now, I should add that though Lance used the original script as a pitch to CBS, Lance states in this interview that he, quote, wrote night and day, 12-hour days for about 2 weeks, literally, meaning a large portion, if not the entirety of the original script was pretty much rewritten by Lance himself, which would explain why Seltzer isn't credited in the final version of the film, although he was honored as one of the writers under the pseudonym Jeremy Thorne, Thorne being the surname of Damien, the devil child from The Omen. Iskov described the production as fast and furious, and you can see that with the energy that this film carries, from the newsroom to NASA, back to the newsroom, on an alien crash landing site. The movie, as slow-paced as it is, really just never stops moving. Information is constantly being conveyed to the audience, and you can really feel how tense it was, much like seeing a real broadcast of an actual tragedy. It was, in many ways, a miracle that this was all put together, and done so convincingly. Hell, apparently when Iskov actually showed this film to people as an example of his past work, well, people were confused, and one person even told him during a meeting, quote, well, they started with this movie, but then it cut away to all this stuff. You're not going to believe it. Something must have happened to the tape. To which he responded with, no, that's the movie. So if even Hollywood producers could be fooled by this movie, were others fooled too? I mean, probably not, right? The film, at multiple instances, remind you that this is, in fact, just a film. In between commercials, in between scenes, I mean, it was just so realistic, and no one wanted a repeat of what occurred back in 1938 that they put in so many reminders that it's just not real. So how could anyone be fooled? Well, here's the kicker. That's exactly what happened. During the movie's airing, there were multiple reports of people calling into CBS asking if the news broadcast they were seeing on TV was real, and many people even called other news stations such as Fox, CNN, NBC, and other local stations just to ask why they weren't talking about this alien invasion occurring. Hundreds upon hundreds of people all over America were scared, fooled by what they were watching, thinking that aliens had finally had enough of us and were pulling the trigger to end humanity. This incident even prompted CNN to ban their reporters from ever appearing in movies ever again to prevent something like this from happening again. Despite all the warnings that this was a fictional movie, the nation was fooled once again. Except they weren't. Were they? Now get ready, because this is, in my opinion, the freakiest part of this whole thing. Check it out. Everywhere I went to research this movie, there was almost always someone mentioning the fact that a ton of people called in and believed 100% that this movie was reported as real news, people stating that this film caused a panic, nowhere near as big as Orson Welles' broadcast did, but it was a panic nonetheless, and yet I have not at all found any evidence of this ever happening. There aren't any news articles of this being reported, no channels ever talking about the controversial airing of this film. Nobody outside of CBS ever reported anyone calling their network to report on the asteroids crashing on Earth. Hell, that CNN fact about not having their newscasters or reporters starring in films anymore, that actually is true, but it wasn't because of Without Warning. It was actually because of a movie called Contact. Now, the only evidence we do have of some people potentially calling in was from Iskov himself, stating that people were calling in wondering why major news networks weren't airing this, as it seemed like critical info. And yes, no doubt some people were fooled out of the potential hundreds of thousands of people that were watching the movie at the same time. But every time I read about this movie, I'm told it caused a much bigger ruckus than it really did. And frankly, I'm willing to bet that the only people that called weren't more than just a handful of viewers. Much like the original broadcast of 1938's War of the Worlds, where despite the headlines of Americans gone mad and rioting on the streets due to one radio show, the reality was that there were only a few calls made to the station. And that honestly creeps me out more than anything that I had talked about thus far. The parallels that this movie has with the radio show are so similar that it even goes down to the false allegations of people getting supposedly freaked out. Even the few who were freaked out paralleled the few who were freaked out back then. It's like history is naturally cyclical, despite being a constant change towards the future. The rhymes are all there, but the people are always different. It's kind of freaky. That's always the case, isn't it? It's weird. I don't know. And look, I just want to say this again. This film is not a jump scare fest, and it's just not the most exciting film ever. But if you appreciate the craft of mockumentaries and you're a big fan of those kinds of films, you might like this. I'd say the experience is similar to looking into a mirror. A mirror into our past, how we reacted, how we behaved, and how we've yet to change. What we believed is the same thing we believe now. All that we see in that reflection is ourselves at a different time, at a different place, but with the same face. Are we going to get fooled again if this happened today? Maybe, honestly. But what would the reaction be then? I don't know. Maybe it'll just be the exact same as it was 20 years ago, as it was nearly 100 years ago. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see y'all next time. Love y'all a ton. Good night. I'd like to give a quick shout out to Ben Folk from thecompanion.app. I took a good chunk of my research from this one article, and you can read it down below, as well as the title itself. Seriously, when it came down to this one film, this probably had the most in-depth research I had found anywhere online. So thank you once again to Ben Folk. I am in no way affiliated with the website or anybody who works on that website. I just wanted to really give a quick shout out. Thank you.